Morning, everybody. I'm Chad Coolis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber, and I'm happy to have you all here for this is part 3 of our 5-part series celebration of nonprofits. And we have our 4th part this Thursday featuring Michael Worth Davis from Goodwill Easter Seals. Our title sponsor for today is Episcopal Homes. Our supporting sponsors, we have Mendoza Law Office, and then we have Riverland Bank. And I want to turn it over to our sponsor from Riverland today, Michelle Mergen.
Thanks, Chad. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Mergen, and I am the branch manager at Riverland Bank. We have 2 locations. I work out of our Northeast Minneapolis office, and we also have one in Jordan, Minnesota. We've been a member for the Chamber for over probably 3 years, I think it is, and we're really proud to support Chamber events such as this. And especially during times like these, I think it's really important that we're supporting the nonprofits in our community. So I'm sure, like most of you, my daily work environment looks different now, but we're still here and we're still open for business and supporting our customers. And Riverland has invested a lot in technology so that we can continue to do business, even if it's not in person. And I'm also happy to say that our nonprofit checking account rates are some of the highest in the metro. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, send me a chat. And basically, we're really honored today to be able to support today's presentation. So that's about it. Thanks. It's great to see everybody. My apologies, we don't have video here. So, but you all look great.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And even though Riverland has only been a member for a few years, Michelle has been an active member and volunteer of the Chamber for many years. So I know a lot of you know Michelle, and she's also on our board. So thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Riverland. We do this event in partnership with Hamline University, and we have for quite a while now. And I'd like to just turn it over to Jeannie Fox to say a few words from Hamline. Jeannie.
Thank you, Chad. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And I hope next year we are back on the Hamline campus, all in the same room. But this series has been fabulous. And in some ways, we're able to reach more people this way. So thank you. I'm super excited to have Cabo with us today. I have known every iteration of Propel back to when it was 2 organizations. Some of you may remember both the Nonprofit Assistance Fund and, oh, now I'm blanking, Management Support Program. Cabo, help me out here.
MAP for Nonprofits.
MAP for Nonprofits. Management Assistance Program was the acronym. See, it just blended so well together. I only think of Propel now, but their training and networking events are top notch. Financial assistance for nonprofits. Minnesota is so lucky because few states have an organization like Propel. So I want to get out of the way and turn it over, whether it's to you, Chad, or to Cabo.
Sure, I'll just do a quick introduction for Cabo. And a reminder to everybody that we do record these, so please feel free to share them with your board, with staff. I think Cabo's got a lot of really useful information she's going to share with us today. And just a little bit of background. So Cabo is the strategic services consultant at Propel. She herself has served on many nonprofit boards for over 10 years. She's currently serving on Street Stops, and Mountaintops and Southeast Asian Resource Action Center. She's also an adjunct instructor in the Organizational Leadership Graduate Program at St. Kate's. So please welcome Cabo Yang.
All right. Thank you, Chad, for having me, for inviting me to be here. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I grew up in the Frogtown area, so shopped many Midway businesses, and certainly feels good to be amongst all of you. So appreciate taking the time on an early morning to be here. So Chad had reached out to us, talking about increased diversity on boards. And it's a very timely topic. I've been at Propel now for 1.5 years, and we've certainly seen an increase in requests for DEI work as part of strategic planning and part of board development in the last year. And we're certainly sensing more urgency this year, in particular, stemming from the racial unrest in Minneapolis. Nonprofits, as you all know, have been doing this work for a long time, but really wanting to take this next step of being very intentional and making it a strategic priority for their organization. I think we've seen it in previous years where diversity, equity, inclusion is one of the goals or it's a final goal of a plan. And now we're seeing they want diversity, equity, inclusion in all aspects of their plan, not as a standalone. And so that's what we're seeing this year going forward. We're certainly seeing this. I would say the biggest request is really increasing diversity on boards as a way to really demonstrate the commitment at the highest level of the organization to DEI work. So very timely for Chad to have me here this morning. So we at Propel certainly are, as is with DEI work, learning from thought leaders where there's no one approach to this work. And so we're continuing keeping our eyes open, keeping our ears open, listening and learning from different models and frameworks and approaches. And we really try to match different approaches to organizations as we work with. And so this work is just evident in that it's really important that we continue to stay on top of the latest work, but also be respectful of prior work as well too, as a lot of it is still pioneering work from prior years. And so today I'll share a very general introduction of different processes that we've worked with in terms of nonprofit organizations and especially with board diversity. Um, and certainly I'm happy to talk with folks offline after, but just a quick overview of our approach so that you have an idea of how we approach this. Before I get too far, I do want to just take a moment and give a little background on Propel. Let me see. I'm using a new screen, so I want to make sure that I'm doing it correctly. All right. So as Jeannie mentioned, we are about 3 years old, and we are a result of a merger of Map for Nonprofits and the Nonprofit Assistance Fund. Both have been around for about 2 to 3 decades each. And so together, we've come together. A lot of the programming from both organizations have um, become under one umbrella. And so these are just a quick overview of what we have at Propel. So we have our accounting and finance, which helps nonprofits to really develop strong financial and accounting systems. So we certainly help with building systems. We do coaching with executive directors and treasurers on how to understand, interpret, and develop financial strategy from their finances. Our board connector, we do connect volunteers to nonprofit boards. And so if you're currently not on a board or would like to be, simply reach out to us. We can match you based on interest, geographic area, and so on. Strategic consulting is where I sit, and we do strategic planning, board development, other organizational impact work in terms of leadership transitions, mergers, and other strategic alliances, and program evaluation, and so on. Fiscal sponsorship, we've got about 50 groups who are not yet 501(c)(3) organizations, but are potentially on the path there. And so we're helping them build some capacity and really make the decision of do they want to be a 501(c)(3) or a different kind of nonprofit, or do they want to exist in a different structure. And so through that, we also provide training, as Jeannie mentioned, as well as financial support and assistance. We have our lending, and so provide nonprofits with lending. A lot of times, the lending is for capital investments. Sometimes it's for organizations who are recipients of government contracts and are needing some cash flow, as government contracts are often on a reimbursement basis. But we certainly are at about $50 million in terms of what we have out in loans to nonprofits throughout the state. And then finally, our leader circle. It is a monthly cohort. And so we have leaders come together and just really provide peer support and coaching to one another, really valuing the knowledge that they each hold and just providing that space for them to connect, share, and coach each other through leadership. And so we have leader circles for executive directors, and we also have leader circles for manager level. You can certainly find more on our website. We do have an extensive resource page, and we have templates and tip sheets for a lot of finance stuff, quite a bit of strategic planning stuff, and quite a bit of board stuff. So certainly check out that. And again, if you have any questions, do reach out to me. I'm happy to either work with you or connect you to one of our team members. So leading with intent is a study that has been done a couple of times. I believe 2017 is either the second or the third report, and it's completed by Board Source, and it is completed. Um, the respondents are executive directors and board chairs, and so this one from 2017, they had a response of 1,759 individuals. So of those, about 1,300 were chief executives, and then about 400 were board chairs. And so this just gives a racial breakdown of self-reporting in terms of chief executive and board chair. So as you can see here, certainly high numbers of Caucasian in leadership and much lower numbers for other racial and ethnic groups here. And so this report really is done to just give a demographic overview, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but they also have studies related to age, gender, and a few other factors. And so certainly check out Board Source. They've got some great resources in terms of just overall board service, but also very specific items related to boards as well too, in terms of um, executive officers and leadership transitions and so on. But just wanted to give this as just kind of a context that this is a national representation of leadership on nonprofit boards, and that there is this collective, I would say, desire to change this, and so this is where we're starting from. And then something that a quote from Audre Lorde that I really appreciate and use quite often is just the statement that it is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Certainly in the nonprofit sector, we have a much more, I would say, advanced celebration and acceptance of differences. We still have a long way to go, but we certainly appreciate and are learning to work across differences. And so, demonstrative of today, and it's certainly for small businesses and corporations who work close to communities, certainly are embracing this as well too, among employees as well as customers and clients. So a framework that I use quite often in consulting, but also as I teach over at St. Catherine, is this cultural intelligence framework. I think for a long time we've talked about cultural competence, and that's an important piece. Cultural competence is really the knowledge piece of this work. Cultural intelligence takes it a step further and really think about how do we use this knowledge then to actually make a difference. And so cultural intelligence has these four components that make up the framework. And this first piece here is on the cognitive, which is the cultural competence of the work. And so it's having the knowledge about different racial, ethnic, cultural groups. The metacognitive is really thinking about how do we know what we know, and how are we processing this? And so are we basing our knowledge on one interaction and one piece of data, or are we basing our knowledge on interactions, knowledge, experiences? So we think about, not only what do we know, but how do we know what we know and how are we processing it? The behavioral piece is how are we using this knowledge to adapt and how is it being portrayed in our work? And so it's the actions of putting this knowledge into work. And then motivational is how and what is our motivation for using this knowledge? And that's where we oftentimes really work with nonprofit boards is the motivational piece. because that takes a lot of just individual and personal reflection of understanding and acknowledging our own biases, our own perspectives, and taking a step back and making space for different perspectives as well too. And so really getting the motivation for that can certainly be challenging sometimes as certain folks aren't quite sure yet where the motivation comes from. So these four aspects I'll certainly address in this presentation going forward, and you'll see it come up in different parts of the processes that we do with nonprofit boards.
Say, Cabo,
Yeah.
when you're measuring CQ, is that based more on an individual or an organization?
The one that I worked with is individual.
Okay.
Sorry, for some reason, my mouse is not working smoothly on this surface here. All right. So, as we talk about increasing diversity, we also have to talk about fostering inclusion. And so, diversity really is just the range of perspectives and the range of experiences that we bring together. Fostering inclusion is ensuring that folks feel welcome, they feel included, they feel they can show up as who they are, and that their experience is appreciated and valued. And so we often talk about both together. We certainly are seeing others adding equity into here, and really seeing equity as changing systems to include those that are most impacted in power and decisions that affect them. And so I'll be covering diversity and inclusion today, but we certainly do work on equity as well too. So when we work with that, and I'm speaking about this work specifically through the board perspective and organizational leadership perspective. And so certainly there's different perspectives, but today's presentation will be coming from the lens of a board and organizational leadership. And so we often emphasize is just the really important internal work that has to happen before we begin recruiting board members. And so we often work with both nonprofit boards to really establish shared language around diversity and inclusion. These two terms certainly have a lot of meaning. And so we really encourage boards to adapt and adopt language that helps them describe how they want to talk about diversity and inclusion. And so we usually have them come together and really share different perspectives on what these terms mean to them, what outcomes they hope to achieve, and then from that we help them develop just some shared language about talking about diversity and inclusion, both internally and externally. And then with having that language, you really have them think about what is the case for diversity? Why is this important to you? And it's just a way to state it and to capture it and to again have some shared language to talk about it when we have, 3 board members or 15 board members, if we're saying 50 different things, it could be very hard for recruitment, for engagement, for retention. And so having this case where we can talk collectively and consistently about why it's important to us is why is just having this case for diversity. And then having that case is when we create the plan for change. And so, certainly, thinking about are our meetings accessible to different board members, our methods, our communications, the materials, and so thinking about what is a plan for change that when we do bring in diverse board members, that they're able to participate and be engaged. So this motivation piece that I brought up earlier, we have to confirm commitment from the board of directors and senior leadership to this work. And so sometimes it shows up in the core values, which is part of mission, vision, and values. Sometimes it shows up as a strategic priority or as even the lens of which we set strategy. And then we often see once they create either a case for diversity or a DEI statement or diversity statement, we often see that elevated to the same level as mission, vision, values. So it becomes part of their organizational compass of how they do their work. So commitment can show up in different ways, but we've seen it show up in these 3 different ways most commonly. Also, before we start recruiting for diverse board members, it's really creating a culture of inclusion. And so thinking about, what structures can we be more flexible in so that we can be more accommodating? What accommodations are we able to provide for various participation and engagement levels and preferences? What are meaningful opportunities that we can leverage skills and experience? We often say, recruit for skill, not for color. And so, sure, we certainly want diversity in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, but we also, see the skill set, their experiences, and we really want to provide opportunities for them to be meaningfully engaged, and not just coming in to fill a quota or to fill a seat. And then complete appropriate training. And so certainly this is a big step for organizations, and both personally and organizationally. And so is this willingness to take trainings, to participate in trainings, not just pre-recruitment, but throughout the whole process. I mentioned earlier, DEI work is an ongoing process, and there's always new tools and frameworks to be aware of. And so some topics that we often see boards request are trainings on implicit bias, white supremacy culture, conflict engagement, and facilitating courageous conversations. Oftentimes, Propel may do this, and sometimes we do contract with groups who are much more equipped to provide these trainings as part of our contract. Um, but yeah, again, these are the most requests that we see from our clients. So this is the pre-work before we start recruiting. This is really getting internally our shared language, our plan for change, and the commitment from the board and the organizational leadership. And so then we move into recruitment. We often hear from nonprofit boards, where do we reach out to? Oftentimes art networks, don't have the diversity that we would like it to be. And so where are some ways that we can reach out to? And so we often encourage them to look into their partnerships, their client base, that's part of their network. Talking to just both government and nonprofit partners, look within their regional areas, so their neighborhoods, their counties. And so really encourage them to reach out to those. And some of these do take some relationship building. And so some of these partnerships and networks aren't very established. We do encourage taking some time to build some partnerships and just to build a relationship, and maintain that relationship as well too. We also encourage boards to provide information sessions or meet and greet sessions so that potential board members have a chance to talk with you, to learn from you, to better understand what environment they're coming into, and to have these where community members are, to have these where individuals are that we're hoping to recruit for. And so instead of having them always come to us, how do we go out to them? Where are they? Where do they feel comfortable that we can be out there, and learning about them and what's important to them as well too. And then really look at how do we make our application process have as minimal barriers as possible. And so we're seeing many more online applications. Do we still have ways to accept paper applications or video applications? And something about what are different ways that we can have folks come to us. And we've also had boards ask about, is there a difference if we bring in a group at a time, as such as a cohort, or do you want to build a pipeline and have them come in over time? And because we tend to work with some smaller nonprofit organizations and smaller boards, we do recommend more staggered terms. Oftentimes, if you bring a whole group of new board members in, there's a capacity challenge for boards to get them orientation, to provide support. And then when their terms end, they leave as a group. And then there's this pretty big gap to fill as far as new board members. And so we do encourage a staggered approach of having maybe twice a year, bringing in a few more board members in the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, and during the process, really building a pipeline. If there's folks who aren't quite ready for board commitment, are there opportunities to serve on a committee so they have a chance to really get exposure to boards? What we're learning is that very few, I would say, not very few, but a less number of professionals of color have certain nonprofit boards. And so it can be intimidating to be on a board. They may be more comfortable being a committee member and having some exposure before joining a board. And so just providing different opportunities for them to participate. Um, and then set priorities for recruitment and really recruiting for skills, experience, and perspectives. One way that we see boards do this is they do a board matrix, which lays out skill sets of current but desired skills. We'll also have seen them do audits. So really an audit of what are our current skills, what skills do we like, what life experiences do we have on the board, what life experience we like to recruit for the board, identities, and so on. So really be intentional about that, um, and then targeting your recruitment for those priorities as well too.
Hey, Cabo, there's a
Yeah.
couple questions on the chat from Don Don Zagay from Mendoza Law, asking what are the primary barriers you see to creating more diverse nonprofit boards? And she's wondering if you can give some examples of how to expand outreach.
hmm Yeah. I think our challenges that we see most are in retention. Once we recruitment, I would say, is just getting out to the right spaces. And so, what I'm seeing has worked is really, tapping into these partnerships and networks, and even reaching into, if we're serving communities of color, reaching into some of our client bases and client populations too. um, and so it's really thinking about not just the board's network, but the organization's network. And even tapping into staff's network. A lot of times we really keep our outreach at our board, and who do we know, but we certainly can reach among staff and ask them for referrals, reach out to partners, reach out to neighborhood groups. So certainly think about what other networks can we be considering besides the board network. um, and recruiting, sometimes that we do see too is just the reputation of the organization. Are you seen as part of the community? Are you seen as authentically engaging communities? And so even understanding just the perception of the organization and communities of color is a barrier that we've seen for recruitment as well too. And then where we certainly see a lot of challenges is around retention. And so you can bring in diverse board members, but if you don't have a space where they feel welcome and where they feel safe being who they are, then they don't stay long. And so, for example, we actually had a recent client that came to us because they wanted to increase diversity. And one board member suggested that we use gender pronouns as we make introductions, and they actually happened to have a prospective board member observing who identified as queer, and he observed this board debate about using gender pronouns, and he of course didn't join the board. He felt like, if this was a debate, then how am I going to feel welcome in this space? And so it's just thinking about how do we create space that are welcoming once we bring in board members. And so retention is where we see a lot of the challenges. Other questions, Chad?
Well, I have a question.
hmm
In your estimate, what do you think is the proper size of a board, and how about length of a board term, and how many terms somebody should have?
hmm Yeah, we get the question of size quite often, and there really isn't a formula for that. We do try to keep boards between 8 to 12. For smaller organizations, the size certainly varies depending on the life cycle of the nonprofit. It certainly varies by the size of the nonprofit. The groups that we tend to work with are, I would say, between 1 to 5 million in terms of revenue or in terms of organizational budget. And so we often see between 8 to 12 members. And those are organizations that are somewhat what we would call policy boards, where they're really looking at organizational policies, enforcing them, revising them. For newer and smaller organizations that are still in the forming stages, we do see smaller boards of maybe 5 to 7, who are much more hands-on and doing much more programming, management, fundraising, and so on. And so I would say, depending on the size of the organization, depending on the life stage, but we do tend to see between 8 to 12 members. As far as terms, we're seeing anywhere from 2 to 3 year terms and renewal for up to 2, possibly 3. And so it could be a 6 to 9 year service, but we certainly are encouraging terms of any limit. for nonprofit boards.
Great. Thank you. No other questions
Sure.
right now. I'll let you move on.
All right. So as we start recruiting and bringing new board members in, orientation is also really important. It's really this welcoming phase of new board members. And so we often see orientation being done as board members are coming in. We're certainly starting to encourage an annual orientation. Bylaws are important, governance documents are important. But if we read it once and we put it away, it's really hard as board members to really be mindful of our governing documents. And so certainly we encourage an orientation of the governance documents as board members come in, but an annual refresher is very helpful to continue to do that. And orientation oftentimes is seen as a very technical aspect of here's the bylaws, here's our meeting schedule, here's our budget. But we're really encouraging time for relationship building and generative thinking too. And so creating space for getting to know each other. Oftentimes folks join boards because of who they get to work with. They join the board because of the mission. They join the board because of the impact, but they end up doing a lot of administrative stuff, and sometimes that becomes, a tool of disengagement. And generative thinking is really creating space to be thinking about what else can we be doing, what's happening that we need to be thinking about, how do you respond to it, and so having this practice of generative thinking, thinking differently, thinking outside the box, and thinking through that as well too. So just create the environment that, we value what you know, we value your perspective, and here are ways that we are creating spaces for generative thinking. Um, Having an opportunity available for board members, either as a pod or a mentor, especially if they're new to board membership, it's going to be very intimidating to ask a question as a new board member. I remember joining my first board, I didn't even know what it meant to make a motion and what it meant to vote. And it was really scary for me to ask what that meant. So had I had somebody either before the meeting or after the meeting just to check in and say, hey, what questions do you have? What concerns do you have? And just having that one-on-one, or even a pot of a few people, either a newer board member and an older board member, or a mix of different folks to really help board members. And even if they have board experience, every nonprofit is different in terms of how they approach their work, and so it might even be an opportunity for experienced board members just to get a chance to know the organization more intimately as well too. And then clarifying expectations. This is really sitting down with new board members, getting a chance to know them. And this is often, it could be the chair, it could be the executive committee, it could be the nominations committee, it could be the governance committee, it could be any one of those. But sitting down with new board members, really talking through expectations for the board, but also their expectations too. And so, what is their preference for engagement? What is their preference for communication? What is their preference for being acknowledged and being recognized? And so just clarifying some expectations. I think oftentimes we have, as a board, um, you know, we are asking 6 hours a month from you, sit on two committees. So we have this, here's what we want from you, but we often don't think about, what would you like from us? And how do we find mutual benefit in this relationship? And so it's having that expectations. This happens as they come in, and it happens, as we check in with board members throughout the time of their service on the board. And so retention is also a big piece of board diversity. Like I said, we have this really big desire to recruit diverse board members, but how do we keep them? And if we have this practice of high turnover of board members of color, it's going to, of course, impact the reputation of the organization. And so retention is really, really critical. So regular check-ins are these times where, well, again, it's either the nominating committee or the executive committee, or it's just the board chair just checking in with, board members. How are you feeling? What recommendations do you have for stronger engagement? What concerns do you have? Checking back in those expectations that were set earlier on in the process. How are we doing with these expectations? What changes would you like to see? And just doing those check-ins. Nothing formal, so they can be more conversation and less of a formal check-in, but just putting that in. A board self-assessment is something that we encourage boards to do. Propel has a tool, BoardSource has a tool. It's often just a way for boards to think about, how are we doing? How are we feeling about our, our recruitment, our engagement, our retention, but also how are we doing in terms of, fundraising and financial management. So it's just a way again to measure how board members are feeling. We do our own assessment. We often get asked by clients, "Oh, how are we doing in comparison to other boards?" And the reality is that's really hard to compare because it really is um, self-reporting of how we feel about these things about ourselves. So very hard to compare, but we certainly have found that those that do board self-assessments certainly feel more engaged because then they are part of creating a board that they want to be. Uh, and so we do encourage them, but we also, remind folks that it's really hard to compare across the sector because boards are all very different, and it's really more just experience with their own nonprofit rather than a set of standards for nonprofit governance. Are there pathways to leadership for board members? Are there opportunities to move into leadership roles? Um, one thing we sometimes see on boards more often than not is when we have executive committee members who really speak negatively about those roles. Oh, it's so hard being a board chair, or being a treasurer is so boring. And when you have those messages from the leadership level, it's also discouraging for board members to want to take those roles. And so when we get to elections, we don't see any nominations. We don't see folks wanting to step up into that. And so it's important to really nurture and create pathways and really show that value in these leadership roles and the importance of learning and growth and influence in these roles as well too. And then a board action plan. So board action plan can look a few different ways. Sometimes it's very focused on the board based on the board self-assessment. So the board self-assessment might identify 2 to 3 key areas for growth, whether it's around recruitment, whether it's around, board staff partnerships. So the board action plan is focused on really moving forward in those goals. A board action plan could also be connected to a strategic plan. And so, what is the board's role in our strategic plan? And it's very tied to organizational outcomes. Or it could be a combination of both. It could be a combination of we as a board have these development goals for ourselves, but we also want to be, part of advancing our strategic plan and being part of these specific goal areas. So again, it could look a few different ways, but it certainly gives a way, and it's a way for board members to feel that they're contributing, that they're engaged, that they're being valued for their skills and experience. And so it's a big piece of retention too, is to feel connected to the mission of the organization. So just a few things on the plan of action, similar to strategic plans. I'm sure many of you have been through a few of those. Having specific strategies, goals, objectives, tasks, timeline, and something that we often see that is missing from plans is the resources needed. So as you do come up with these strategies and goals, think about what are the resources that we need in terms of financial resources, people resources, other things in terms of technology, marketing support. So we do really encourage boards that as you create these plans, make sure that there's resources that are attached to it. Otherwise, these plans just sit in a shared folder and it's very hard to move forward. So just a few components of our plan that we really encourage boards to think through. And if there are components that are related to staff, we really do encourage some staff involvement and staff decision making in this process as well too. But that certainly varies from board to board. And then just closing here with some things to keep in mind is really to encourage the integration and embedding diversity and inclusion practices into the strategies, into organizational procedures, that it is part of the operations and not just a standalone initiative to be done separately when there's time, when there's resources. And so really encouraging that. that as you do this work, whether it's a recruitment plan or a plan of action, continue to monitor, evaluate, and modify. We're going to learn as we go. And as we do, be open to doing that. We'll make mistakes. Whether it's a language we use, an approach we use. So be open to learning, to be open to, and we often encourage organizational leaders encourage this environment of learning together and to and to really have this space of talking openly about when you've made a mistake or when you've used the wrong term or you've used the wrong and so a word that might be offensive to others. And so like we recently learned, we often use the word board buddy in what I mentioned earlier, and somebody's like, that's not, we're encouraging the use of pods and having this more kind of communal approach versus a, hierarchical, mentor to mentee approach. So it's being open to learning, and we're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. It's an ongoing learning journey. There's always new tools coming out. I feel like even for someone doing this work, there's the language is changing so much. It's really hard to keep up, and not just around racial equity, but around gender identity, around class, around so many aspects of identity. And so being open to learning and adapting as you go, and then creating adaptive culture that is responsive and flexible. And so creating opportunities to be reflective and to change. So creating that culture that, that's important, that we're learning and that we're adapting and continuing to be relevant. And that diversity and inclusion, as Chad mentioned earlier, it takes place at different levels. It takes place at individual levels, organizational levels, and community levels. And so, as you think about diversity and inclusion strategies, think about what is this, how does this affect the organization, individually, organizationally, and community wise. Um, Celebrate small successes. This work is hard. It's hard work. It's intense work, so take those small successes and just really acknowledge that you're making progress. And, it's a good motivator as you're doing these things. And then seek assistance and guidance. No one of us knows this work. It's work that is, we're learning from all different aspects and perspectives. And so do seek assistance, do seek guidance. As I mentioned earlier, Propel we often bring in trainers who are much more knowledgeable on certain topics, um, and they do great work at it. And so do seek that out. So with that, that's the end of my piece. I know I've covered a lot and I spoke really fast. So certainly want to just open up for any kind of questions or comments or insights that we can share that with one another.
Thank you, Cabo. Yes, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I'll start with one. So I think a lot of organizations out there, they love the idea of becoming more diverse on their board, but they might be looking at themselves saying, we don't have any great candidates for that. When we think about our dedicated donors or volunteers, we don't know who the right person would be. And my personal opinion is I don't think it's good to just put somebody there, and if you're setting themselves up for not being involved in the board, if they're just there because you want to check the box that you become diverse. So I think for a lot of organizations, they really need to lay some groundwork before they ask somebody, and really get to know a more diverse group of people. So I think it starts before even the board ask, and trying to get the organization more diverse by just their connections. First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, do you have recommendations on how they can do that?
Hmm. Yeah, certainly agree with that. We really focus on relationships when it comes to recruitment, whether it's relationships with community groups or with partners, and building that rapport. So I grew up uh, um, going to Hmong New Year events and Hmong, big festivals. And I grew up seeing the 3M logo. I grew up seeing the Wells Fargo logo. I grew up seeing the Bremer Bank logo. I grew up seeing um, who else? Insurance, logos. And so those became like my desired places for employment because I was familiar with them. I felt like they knew the community and that they care about our community. And so it does take time to build that kind of presence and trust in community groups. And so certainly, whether it's the board level or staff level, organizational leadership level, do take the time to build those relationships to get to know what is the impact that our organization has in the community, what can we learn from the community, how can we advance this relationship. And so it does take that time to do that. It also takes time as board members to really think about what does it mean to bring this diverse perspectives in? What does it mean to bring somebody who might speak differently, who might have a different skill set and still contribute to the board? And so a big piece of retention is providing meaningful opportunities of engagement. So like, as you said, if we're just bringing folks in to fill a seat, they're going to feel devalued. They're going to leave the board and they're going to leave with a sour taste in the mouth. And so, before we even bring folks in, what opportunities do we have to really, give them meaningful engagement, to ensure that they are using their skills and their experience and their talent to advance the board. And so it really is preparing those opportunities ahead of time and then, having those ready for folks to come in. Um, Yet another question to Chad.
Um, well, just about how how you can lay that groundwork ahead of time and try
Mm-hmm,
to build those relationships with people who potentially could be on your board someday.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So we certainly, so early in the process, we do work with nonprofit boards in terms of what are learning areas you would like to have before we move too far forward. So we do some trainings before we move into even the planning piece. Trainings around, the topics that I mentioned earlier in terms of implicit bias, conflict engagement, white supremacy culture. So, what are ways that we're either perpetuating exclusive spaces, and what are ways for us to be aware of that and move that forward? So, we do certainly begin with look at our current processes, our current structure, and what barriers do these pose for bringing in new board members? And so, even assessing internal processes before moving too far forward, doing some trainings in areas that the board identifies as areas of growth, setting some growth goals in terms of, how do we want to be different as we do these trainings. So we do a lot of work in terms of just board assessment, board development, um, and in the process, thinking about how do we develop authentic relationships that are mutually beneficial to us and to partners. What does it mean to build relationships? What does it mean to have mutually beneficial relationships and so on? So there's a lot of internal work before we go forward. We certainly have come across some boards where they are not in the same position when it comes to this work. They might see it as important, but there's still a bit of hesitation in terms of changing their own behaviors. So those are places when we stop and say, we're not sensing a full commitment from the board. What we're sensing could cause some friction for incoming board members. And so we really need you to think through the commitment. And so we do certainly see that even though groups come to us with this desire, there's still some hesitation among some board members. And, we don't, if that's the case, we really discourage recruitment until we can overcome some of those. And so, um, we're very clear that not everybody is quite ready yet, even though they feel like they are. There's some things as we dig a little bit deeper that there's not quite the readiness yet.
Great. Jeannie Fox has a question. In your board matching service, what are some of the outreach avenues you have to diverse communities?
Yeah, so that's an area that so Propel is actually going through strategic planning. So we're 3 years old. We did a very quick merger. Our merger was all of 6 months from the decision to when it was merged. And so we've learned over the last 2 years that, we probably should have thought some things through. And so we're going to strategic planning. And a big piece of that is a community engagement process where we're having focus groups with a wide range of community groups. And so we're including leaders of color, including Greater Minnesota, including, client populations. And we really want that input as our lens of our strategy development. And so a big piece of that is how are we getting diverse board members as part of the pool to serve on nonprofit boards? Because we're certainly still seeing, when we have nonprofits reach out to us looking for board members, we still have a pretty, I would say, consistent representation from corporate and from middle to upper income volunteers. And so even for us, it's been hard to really look for board members of color. And so we're hoping to really think about what does that mean for us in terms of board matching. We certainly are seeing other groups that are doing really important work in this area. And so learning from them, but also trying to complement their work as well too, and uplift their work as well. But yeah, Jean, that's an area that we're certainly working on and need to grow in.
Great. I think it's great to be able to have a diverse board, but then how do you make your organization itself more inclusive? Thinking about tasks that a board can handle, it can be creating that diversity statement, but actually seeing to it. What does your board agenda look like going forward? And are you actively working on being a more inclusive organization with how you look at your vendors, how your mission statement is addressing the needs of a diverse and inclusive community? Can you talk a little bit, Cabo, about how a board should go about doing that and what are some of the factors they should be looking at?
Mhm. Yeah, so we try to really encourage kind of these four approaches to not just board meetings, but just board gatherings. And so the first piece is, of course, the business piece. And so finance updates, program updates, that kind of thing. Another piece is the generative thinking. Are we creating opportunities for continually thinking about what's out there that we're not involved in? And this is where, it's engagement is important for board members is to really hear from their perspectives. What's happening that you're involved in that we could be more involved in, or what are you seeing that we're not seeing? And so generative thinking is just having this opportunity to really think differently and not follow this agenda so strictly. Relationship building is just the personal piece of being on a board. We're all coming here to support this organization. We all come here because we have this unique skill set, this unique experience. How do we work together? How do we learn from each other? And how do we, value each other's perspectives? And this fourth piece is learning together. And so it's having this shared learning, whether it's bringing in speakers, going on site visits. Um, Oftentimes boards are in the boardroom and they don't get to visit the child care center. They don't get to visit the food shop. They don't get to visit. And when that happens, they certainly start to think differently and see things differently. And it's a shared experience as a board they can reflect on and grow together. So as we look at, diverse perspectives on the board is also really getting the board into diverse spaces and diverse opportunities to be and to think as well too. And so just creating opportunities for generative thinking, creating opportunities for learning together, for building relationships. And during these site visits, that's where relationships happen. That's where community members see board members coming in and feeling like, oh, we feel seen, we feel valued, from the board. Um, and even when it comes to speakers, oftentimes we seek far and wide for experts. When we have experts in our organization, we have staff members, we have other board members who have great experience and knowledge that we keep overlooking, and we keep, trying to get, a speaker. So tapping into the talent among the staff and the board as well too. Um, just to hear and to listen and to be a part of a different way of seeing things. And so yeah, so those four aspects, and we're just continuing to value the perspectives that we have in our organization, as well as outside as well too.
You brought up a good point there, Cabo, how where people are looking to become more diverse or how they can become more connected to diverse communities. I'm thinking of a conversation I had recently with Dr. Artika Tyner, who was a former board member of ours, a professor at St. Thomas. And she said, organizations, they look to the big name speakers that are national, but they have people in their own community who can speak
Hmm.
eloquently on these subjects, and they're the ones that know their own communities better too. So don't forget to look within your own community.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important message to give and to remind people about. So yeah, I think, you know, what you're saying, it's good. I also think about our own organization, the Midway Chamber, and how a couple years ago our board went out and we just wanted to listen to the voices of different people in our community. So every board member went out and met with one, two, or three different people. They weren't all diverse members of our community, but they
Mhm.
represented a diverse section of our community, from nonprofit, higher ed, businesses, just organizations, some that were connected to us a little bit, but some that had never met us before. And we just got to learn a little bit more about what their needs were with our community. So I would encourage boards out there and organizations to think about that too, to get expand your reach and learn about other organizations in our community.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when I was at the Women's Consortium, we're a statewide nonprofit, but like many of us, we're really Twin Cities centric. And I did a listening tour of Greater Minnesota, and just the being out there to them was enough. They're like, one, you're here to listen to us, but two, you made time to come out here. Nobody comes out and listens to us. It's always if we either come down there or we're forgotten. And so, yeah, so even being there is important to a lot of these groups. And then, secondly, is how do you report back to them what you heard? How do you really demonstrate that we came, we listened, here's what we did? So many groups often are tapped in and then they don't hear back from groups. And so, certainly do look for ways to communicate back to communities on what you heard, how it was important, and how it was used for your organization.
Hmm. Right. I quickly want to ask you again about that cultural intelligence, the CQ. Is there a test that people can take for that?
There's a few different assessments. And so there's one that I used for my students. It was a couple years ago, and it was actually developed. And that one in particular was based on expatriate managers and those that were successful, how they were successful, and so it was based on their skill sets and what they did. But there's a few different tools that I can certainly look for and send to you, Chad.
That would be great.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
hear that, and we'd be able to pass it on.
Hmm.
Well, we are right about our stop time at 9 o'clock. So I want to thank you, Cabo, for sharing your insight with us. And if you could send that PowerPoint over to me, we'll share that with our group today as we share the recording. A reminder: we are going to be back again this upcoming Thursday here with Michael Worth Davis. And I want to also mention, a week from today, we're going to be hearing from the Budget Commissioner, Jim Showalter, and today is when we are going to be getting the next budget forecast that we're going to have going into session. So it should be very interesting, and we'll send information out about that to everybody too. So thank you so much, and I hope everybody has a good day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Chad. Thanks, everyone.
everyone.
Have a good day.